Everybody, welcome to this episode of the show. And I'm delighted, as always, to be joined by my colleague and in-house analyst at the Miriam Institute, Yaakov Lappin. Yaakov, it's great to have you with me again. And I'd like to begin by diving right in. And I want to start the conversation with what is taking place inside the Gaza Strip, because as our listeners will be aware, Operation Oz V'Cherev, Operation Courage or Strength and Sword, is underway now inside Gaza, and this is a return to the fighting there. And it is steadily, in my opinion, ratcheting up. I want to give everybody an overview of what we know to this point. Firstly, the Israel Defense Forces in the midst of widening the buffer zone inside the Gaza Strip. That's the buffer zone that runs around the perimeter of the north and east of the Gaza Strip. And as we know, troops are currently stationed along the Philadelphia corridor in the south of the Gaza Strip. We're also seeing the return of forces to the Netzarim corridor. That's the corridor that bifurcates north from south Gaza, along which the Israel Defense Forces has operated really since the ground incursion following the massacre of October the 7th. It's also the corridor along which I was serving during my reserve duty inside Gaza, so I'm able to comment on that from first-hand experience. And there is a steady and very clear policy of eliminating government officials of Hamas that are inside the Gaza Strip. So we're seeing those targeted eliminations as well. And in addition to all of that, we're seeing an end being brought to the supply of humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip, something that Israel was compelled to facilitate during the Biden administration. It does not seem that there is any such compulsion under the current administration in the White House in the United States of America. Now, what is the aim of all of this? Well, the aim seems to be right now, Yaakov, and you'll come back with all of your commentary and insight in due course, as I know, seems to be to drive Hamas back to the negotiating table. Indeed, Prime Minister Netanyahu expressed that from this moment on, from this time on, negotiations for the release of Israel's hostages will take place only under fire, not in the midst of what has been seen to be a very tenuous and rather long-lasting ceasefire. And I say long-lasting because it lasted far longer than it was scheduled to last. Now, if that doesn't work, there is a presumption that military operations inside Gaza are going to escalate. And I think many people are baffled by what an escalation might look like, given the damage that the IDF has rendered to various parts of the Gaza Strip. I hasten to add, legitimately so and appropriately so. But if there are additional measures, those are likely to include the relocation of the civilian population. As we know, some of that population had returned north during the course of this ceasefire. There will be an increase of forces in readiness for a broader and wider and deeper and potentially longer-lasting ground incursion. And I think that all of that, Yaakov, suggests that Hamas is grossly miscalculating the seriousness and the determination of Israel to achieve two of its war goals, namely the ending of Hamas as the ruling body of the Gaza Strip, and, of course, the return of our hostages. Now, this is not without complexity. It's not without legitimate, well-founded anxiety and concern. The question of whether or not Hamas will harm, kill, assassinate, murder our hostages, of course, is uppermost in the minds of all of us who are watching this. And there is also the question of whether or not the eradication of Hamas as a governing entity inside the Gaza Strip is even a war aim that can be achieved. I actually believe that it can be achieved, and with sufficient determination and vigor, it actually will be achieved. But uppermost in the minds of those who might critique the operation inside Gaza and the return to hostilities is the question of whether or not this will result in the killing of our hostages. Just recently, Hamas did express that they still hold the hostages and that they are willing to kill those hostages in the event that the Israel Defense Forces doesn't withdraw from the Gaza Strip. So all of that is to set the stage, Yaakov. I would be very pleased to hear some of your analysis.
Yeah, well, listen, you covered, I think, a lot of ground there, and really, I think you described most of what's going on. I would add that I think that this resumption of airstrikes, the fact that it targeted first and foremost senior members of Hamas's political regime
Hmm.
is very, very significant because I think this represents a change. One of the failures of the kind of war that Israel prosecuted until now, and I say this as somebody who has been basically saying that what Israel achieved in Gaza is unprecedented in the history of asymmetric warfare, urban warfare, underground challenges, terrible, brutal enemy that's embedded in hospitals and schools, and all the things that we've said in the past. So I'm actually of the opinion that what Israel achieved so far in Gaza from a military perspective is historic and will be
Hmm.
studied by Western militaries for decades to come. But one of the failures was the refusal by Israel, and I think that this really came from the military, to go after the political regime of Hamas. And the reason that we are not as far as we could be at this stage of the war, why, when we went for the ceasefire, Hamas was still standing on its feet despite all of the damage that it sustained, I think really comes down to that. It's the political regime, it's the theft of aid, and this is the basis of Hamas. This is the linkage between the terror army and the civilian population. It's the political regime. That's the linkage that enables Hamas to survive. And if you take that away, that you take away Hamas's ability to really survive as the ruling entity of Gaza. And so the stopping of the aid and now the strikes that are directly targeting the political, so-called political. These are all terrorists, of course. And
Hmm.
I was actually looking at some of the bios of the terrorists that were eliminated. It's worth pausing over. We're talking about Issam al-Daalis. He was the head of Hamas government and basically kind of like a prime minister and a few other prominent ones that the IDF has highlighted that were killed in the first wave of airstrikes. A terrorist named Mohammed al-Jamasi. He was the head of Hamas's internal security apparatus.
Yaakov,
And
your sound has gone out.
oh,
There
that's
you
not.
go. You're back.
Ah, okay.
Thank you. Carry on.
So it's the equivalent of the prime minister, and it's also a number of terrorists that were basically running Hamas's domestic security forces, which were themselves an intrinsic part of the terrorist infrastructure of Hamas. There's no separation. This is all one continuum. So this focus is basically, I think, a signal of intent by Israel. And one of the goals certainly is as you said, it's to push Hamas back to the negotiation table, but under terms that are favorable for Israel. And this is another thing that I think, we have to pause on, and I'll get to that in a second, why this is so important. But the second goal, I think, behind this resumption of combat is to begin to dismantle Hamas as the ruling regime of the Gaza Strip. And these two goals are now being pursued simultaneously. And this is the first time I've seen these two goals really being pursued simultaneously. This is a different kind of war that Israel is now fighting based on the targets that it's hitting. And this is alongside the usual targets, rocket launchers and military infrastructure, the things that we know that Israel has been hitting for, a year and a half. So one more thing I'll say about this is that it's very important, I think, because there's been a lot of back and forth in Israel. Was Israel the one that violated the ceasefire, which is an absurd thing that I've seen, in the press here, in the Israeli press, not in the Egyptian press, Ben, and not in some sort
I've
of
noticed the very same in the Israeli press, the very same. But
yeah,
carry on,
and,
Yaakov.
and it's an elephant in the room. I don't think we can ignore it. So what was Hamas demanding? Never mind that the chances that it would release all of the hostages is zero because that's their insurance policy. We know that. But what were they demanding? Even if we take them at their word, they
Hmm.
were demanding that Israel withdraws from the security perimeter, which runs almost a kilometer into Gaza, and from Philadelphia corridor. That's the border between Egypt and Gaza. Now, if Israel had done that, that would mean that Hamas is back on the border and that the Western Negev
On the border,
communities,
by the way, not on the border with Israel, and also on the border with Egypt, which has been its
exactly,
supply line.
exactly, and so from that position, the ability of Hamas to launch new cross-border death squad raids would become imminently possible. And I think all it would take would be another two or three of those raids, and forget, massive scale. Like I could envisage, three terror squads crossing the border, one to, each one to a different kibbutz.
Mm.
That would be enough, I think, to represent a death blow to the Western Negev, because that area is just now starting to get back on its feet. So if they were to absorb another cross-border raid, I think that that would actually be an existential a blow to the idea that the South is inhabitable by Israeli Jews. And that's what's at stake here. This is what Hamas is demanding. And this price, this risk is not being talked about, hardly being talked about in the Israeli media, which I find incredible, shocking. I have no words that this is not being discussed. This is why Israel did not agree to go into the so-called stage two that the Biden administration had worked out as part of the subsequent stages in this deal, because it would obviously represent an existential threat to southern Israel, to the ability of Israeli Jews to continue to live in southern Israel. This is what we're talking about here. I think that Israel absolutely did the right thing here. There's no choice but to resume the work of dismantling Hamas and trying to push them back into the negotiation table. Absolutely, if they're willing to give up a significant number of live hostages, then of course I think Israel will have to take that and should take that. But otherwise, it's going to continue, and I think it's going to push the civilians into the Al-Mawasi humanitarian area, and Hamas's area of control is just going to start shrinking more
Well,
and more.
that's
Yeah,
already happening. There are
right.
20,000 Gazans who are reported to have left Bet Hanun in the north of the Gaza Strip, which I think is an excellent development. I don't think they should ever have been allowed to return there. I spoke about that in previous podcasts. People can scroll back and listen to prior episodes between you and me on that point. The notion that the Gazans could be permitted to return in safety to their homes, while the residents of the Western Negev, to your point, could not have been assured of the very same because of the resurgence and the return of the Gazans, from whom Hamas is recruiting and who give Hamas succor and who are supportive of Hamas, to me was utterly, utterly wrong-headed all the way through. So I'm very pleased to see that 20,000 Gazans have been compelled to move from Bet Hanun, that area that I just mentioned, towards what I believe they will ultimately end up at, the Mawasi area. I think is very, very positive. There is also something that people should keep in mind here, Yaakov, which is that Hamas really is in a dramatically enfeebled position. This is something that I don't think, you just accurately and correctly spoke about the lack of emphasis of various points by the Israeli media. Here's a point that the Israeli media, in my opinion, does not speak to with sufficient emphasis at all. Just how enfeebled Hamas is. Hamas is now without the threat to Israel of Hezbollah. Hezbollah is still there, but it is deeply, deeply wounded, severely wounded. It is also, incidentally, without the harassment of the Houthis. The Houthis are now the object of the focus of the United States military, designated as such by President Trump, spoken about very, very clearly and in terms that were not equivocal at all by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and the Americans' determination to bring to an end the threat of the Houthis to those international shipping lanes and to international commerce. So they are on the back foot, and then some. And then, of course, you have President Trump expressing that he holds Iran culpable for the actions of the Houthis. So the Iranians are going to be far more measured and considered and inhibited when it comes to their action in this entire constellation. And of course, we don't have Hezbollah planted there in southern Syria, as they were as well, in addition to southern Lebanon. So the IDF has also taken out the control and command of Hamas inside the Gaza Strip. They are recruiting, but they're recruiting people who, of course, do not have the experience of the former
Right.
brigade commanders, for example, of Hamas. So
Right.
they are in a very, very weak position. Their rhetoric can be whatever they wish it to be, but their position and their reality is very, very precarious indeed. In addition to that, it's worth people also understanding that Israel's return to the fighting is going to be phased, and we're actually going to see some of that phasing come into play in the coming 24 hours. So we're now there operating as you've described, as I've described. That operation and the success of that operation when it comes to driving Hamas to the negotiating table will be assessed by the Prime Minister and by the Security Cabinet. If it is deemed that the fighting at its current level is not resulting in Hamas coming back to the negotiating table, it will be ratcheted up. And an example of that is the fact that the Golani Brigade, the vaunted infantry brigade of the Israel Defense Forces, is massing on the border with the Gaza Strip as we speak. And the Air Force is operating in Bet Hanun, it's operating in Nuseirat, and it's operating elsewhere as well. And the reason that it's operating, despite what I said about it being enfeebled, Yaakov, and I'd like your perspective on this, in those areas, is because it's within those areas and elsewhere that Hamas is, despite being injured, despite being decimated in the true sense, 1 in 10 being taken off the battlefield, they are yet working to recover, retrain, and to attack. So reconcile that with Israel's war aims of ridding the Gaza Strip of Hamas control.
So, first of all, I think that I'm able to state as fact that Hamas has used the past 2 months, the ceasefire, not only to regroup and to basically reach out to young Gazan men and say, do you want to go on a payroll? Take an AK-47, take an anti-tank missile launcher, hide it in these areas and get ready to fire on the IDF on site, start planting bombs. This is what's been going on for the past 2 months. So obviously they have used this time not only to start regrouping, but they also had intentions to launch new attacks against Israel. That I can state as fact.
Yaakov, I'm sorry, I want to just add something. I'm sorry again to interrupt you, but
sure.
It's not merely that they're asked to go on the payroll, as you expressed. It's of course that they are there for the hire because many of them are ideologically assigned to the notion of killing Jews and Israelis. That's why they're purchasable, right? That's why so many
Of course.
inside Gaza are put. In other words, if they were to be put on the payroll to go and do something else, they might be somewhat resistant to it. But I do want people to recognize that they're predisposed to this mission set, which is to facilitate the death of Jews and Israelis.
They're utterly committed to the cause of jihad. They're the products of multi-generational brainwashing. And they're basically systematic human weapons that Hamas raised from birth for the purpose of exactly that, of becoming the Islamic holy fighter, what they call the mujahideen. And this touches on what you were asking earlier about how can they still be regrouping? And I know that you know the answer, but many of our viewers don't. When it comes to the blows that they've sustained, and we're really talking about the majority of their original order of battle. The majority of this terror army has either been killed, injured, or captured by Israel. And many of these new recruits are indeed just new recruits with zero or next to zero training. So how can they still be doing that? Because the nature of this enemy, and I saw a piece in the Hebrew media saying, why, aren't we going for a 6-day war kind of speedy victory? And the people who ask these questions still haven't internalized the nature of the enemy that we are dealing with. These jihadist terrorists have looked back at the history of past Arab-Israeli wars, and they've concluded decades ago that the way to overcome Israel is the asymmetric warfare doctrine, the ability to melt away and then regroup, the ability to suddenly become a so-called civilian by simply putting on civilian clothes, hiding the weapons under the bed, leaving the bombs under the road, and just melting away. That's what they do. They'll melt away into the hospitals and into the schools and into UNRWA facilities. And then when the fighting stops, and they always count on it to stop, that's when they regroup. Like a cancer, the tumors will very quickly start reappearing. And therefore, the only way, in my view, to defeat this enemy, to fundamentally defeat it, is to do exactly what we haven't done until now, which is to seize territory militarily, I'm talking about, and hold it. In other words, the raid model here of going in and going out, and it doesn't matter why, this happened, we can probably go into it another time. That's not going to work with Hamas. We will never achieve victory if we move in and then go out. What we have to do are the three basic military victory, let's call it order of steps, yeah, which is seizing territory, clearing it out. Once the territory is seized, it has to be cleared out, and then basically making sure that the enemy does not rebuild by
holding it. The next step is holding it, is what you
yeah,
just
but then
mentioned.
after holding it, setting up an alternative system. It can be very basic. I'm not talking about anything, fancy here, in which the ability to distribute food, medicine, water, etc., is not left in enemy hands. This is the third stage. This is a military administration. That word that the former chief of staff was so scared of confronting. And according to multiple reports, the new chief of staff, Eyal Zamir, has no problem with doing that. He thinks that there's absolutely no problem with Israel setting up a temporary military administration. I can't stress enough how important this is going to be for the victory. All of these ingredients have got to come together. That's how Hamas will lose control of the Gaza Strip. There is no other way.
And I think that Minister of Defense Katz has made a very strong statement, incidentally, and I'm going to quote it. He expressed that if all of our hostages are not released and Hamas is not banished from the Gaza Strip, Israel will act in a manner the like of which you, and he's addressing himself to the residents of the Gaza Strip, have never seen before. He seems to, you spoke about the new chief of staff. There seems to be much more alignment between Prime Minister Netanyahu's view, Minister of Defense Katz's view, and the new Chief of Staff Eyal Zamir's viewpoint, and that should make for clearer decision-making, swifter decision-making, and decisions being taken that actually have immediate implications and durable implications in terms of prosecuting this fight against Hamas. So I'm hopeful that that will occur. Now, it's worth mentioning what Hamas has got to say about this, because one of their spokespersons, it's always good to hear from the voice of a terrorist, one of their spokespersons has expressed that, the quote, "We will not return the hostages until Israel commits to end this war and to withdraw from the Gaza Strip."
Well, is anybody surprised? I mean, they're not stupid. They're holding the hostages for that reason. They're not going to give up the hostages because they know that as soon as they do that, there's nothing to stop Israel from finishing the job. So their interest is to create this very, very long-winded, basically endless drizzle of negotiations, stalling, diplomatic crises, piling on the pressure. They want to see Israel tear itself apart with internal protests and pressure on the government. They used to be able to harness the Americans to pressure Israel. They can no longer do that. They used to be able to count on other Iranian proxies to fire on Israel. They can no longer do that. So as you say, their situation has severely, severely deteriorated. I'm not going to guess what they're going to do because I've long given up on even the attempt to do so. But, they're Hamas. So I know that they're not stupid. I know that they're jihadist, fanatical fundamentalists who will very likely end up fighting right until the end because that's what they're programmed to do. But will they look for some sort of tactical breathing space? Will they suddenly come up with a new offer? They might well do that. And if we're able to get more hostages alive, then that would be very good news. I think, we should definitely be open to those opportunities. But the big picture is that this old paradigm where Hamas was using the hostage situation to create this indefinite flow of negotiations and bad offers and pressure on Israel, that has now been shattered. And I think that that was a bold move by Prime Minister Netanyahu. I'm very pleased, as you say, that the new military leadership, we also have a new commander of the Southern Command, Major General Asul, former commander of the Golani Brigade. He's coming in with lots of fresh perspectives, and he doesn't have the catastrophic failure of the seventh hanging over him as Finkelman did. So that's also an important change to note from a military perspective. So look, at the end of the day, there's a lot of new energy coming into this war effort, and I think that Israel's security situation is continuing to improve, and this is ultimately positive. And I totally share also the deep, deep worry for the fate of the hostages.
But there's also something that should be of great concern to everybody, and it really does parry off what you just said with regard to the safety of the hostages. There was a tremendous amount of faith placed in the bargaining savvy and the negotiating savvy of the Trump administration and also his special envoy to the Middle East, as opposed to his absurd special envoy for hostages, Adam Bola. There was great hope for the negotiating savvy of Steve Witkoff. Now, Witkoff proposed a new pathway forward, and I remind everybody, 59 hostages are still left inside the Gaza Strip, 24 of whom rather, are believed to be alive still. And Witkoff had made a sort of bridging proposal. And what he had called for was the extension of the ceasefire by several weeks in exchange for the release by Hamas of 5 living and 10 dead hostages. Now, that bridging proposal has failed. It has not worked. It has not come to fruition. And I think that what that should do is convey to everybody that we may be at the end of the successful outcome of even the most determined and skilled negotiating efforts. What do you think about that? Because that is I can tell you definitively, that is tantamount to the complete dashing of the hopes of so many hostage families and hostage family members who were pinning those hopes precisely not on the Prime Minister of Israel, not Israel's negotiating team, not Gal Hirsch, not Nitzan Alon, not the head of the Mossad, David Barnea, not the head of the Shin Bet, Ronen Bar, not the deputy head of the Shin Bet, not Ron Dermer, Minister of Strategic Affairs, but on President Trump and his special envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff. Those hostage families will now understand degrees of despair.
I mean, look, I've been saying for months that the art of the deal does not apply to jihadists, cannot apply to jihadists. It's not going to work with Hamas. It's not going to work with Iran, because the fundamental religious, cultural, ideological gaps are so large that it is impossible to reach, I think, a major deal with Hamas at this time. I am still open to the idea of some sort of interim deal that they will try to buy themselves time, and if we can get hostages out in that manner, then that's all the better for it. But at the end of the day, I think Hamas is really going to try and fight this out because they understand that everything has changed, everything has turned against them, and we've heard all kinds of ridiculous, desperate, plans, not only from Egypt, also from here. Maybe they'll disarm. Maybe Hamas will disarm. Does anybody really think that Hamas is going to disarm after fighting, for a year and a half, massacring 1,200 of our people, that they're going to lay their guns down and stop being Hamas. And what bigger signal of defeat could they send than doing that? They will never disarm. And so if they're not going to disarm, what are their choices? They'll take tactical breaks if they can, and they're going to continue fighting us and trying to kill us. That is what they do. And they're going to try and use the hostages to slow us down. That's it. There's not more to it than that, unfortunately. So I think, we have to think outside of the box. And if this military ground offensive, which is now just beginning, as you said, in phases, if it becomes much more massive and we end up taking more and more of Gaza, I can envisage a situation where some of the hostage holders can be spoken to directly. In this case, when they're surrounded geographically by our armed forces, and instead of going through Qatar, instead of going through Hamas overseas, instead of going through Egypt, perhaps some of these hostage holders, when they see that their situation has reached the end of the road, perhaps they, perhaps some of these clans that are holding the hostages can be told, listen, you can be given safe passage out of Gaza. Your fate will not be the same as Muhammad Sinwar and the other terrorist war criminals. If you give up the hostages, you can leave. And that could be a whole different negotiation dynamic, which I haven't given up hope that might still happen in certain cases. And we've also got rescue operation options, which I don't know anything about operationally. I haven't been spoken to about this. This is obviously extremely sensitive, but my assumption is that these options are always being looked at. And my hope is that
that's correct. That's
remain
absolutely
realistic.
correct. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think that's absolutely correct. The efforts to rescue hostages are ongoing and ending, and of course are aborted based on the danger that they place on the hostages in a given situation, or aborted in accordance with an untenable amount of danger, if assessed to be the case, toward the hostages. And also, by the way, if assessed to be the case in terms of danger toward the soldiers or the operatives who would be involved in those rescue operations. I think a lot of people fail to understand that that's also a very serious consideration when it comes to determining whether or not to launch a rescue attempt, a rescue operation. I also know from speaking to some of the hostages who were rescued from inside Gaza, and also some of the hostages who were released from inside Gaza, that the rescue operations undertaken, which of course we're all supportive of, are not without repercussions and ramifications. The rescued hostages from one area of the Gaza Strip can result in the increased severity of the conditions in which other hostages are held within Gaza, down to the environment in which they're held, whether they're held above ground or below ground, whether they are the victims of severe beatings and attacks, whether they become those hostages who remain inside Gaza post a successful rescue operation, whether they become the victims of increased starvation, of increased dehydration, of increasingly depraved conditions for their capture. All of that is a consideration. All of that is very, very real within the minds of the decision makers in Israel when it comes to hostage rescue operations. It's an interesting idea that you've put forward. It's the first time I've heard of that, about the notion of speaking to individual captors inside Gaza. My only hope would be that were that to meet with success and come to reality, that of course the moment we have the hostages back and those captors are so-called released, in parentheses, they swiftly receive a sniper's bullet to the center of the chest, aimed with the intent to kill. That would be my hope. I don't think those people deserve to walk free anywhere on the face of the earth at any time. Now, I do want to speak about one other matter with regard to this, and that is the war aim that I think to a degree, has been scandalized within Israel by the media, by commentators, by analysts, and that is the war aim of bringing a permanent end to the reign of Hamas inside the Gaza Strip and preventing Hamas from ever constituting and representing a threat to the Israeli people from inside the Gaza Strip ever again. Now, This is something that I cannot understand. I cannot understand the neurosis among the media that leads them to express time and again that it is impossible to eradicate Hamas as a threat from the Gaza Strip and that it is impossible to banish Hamas as a governing ideology from the Gaza Strip. What are your thoughts on that? And then I'll chime in with some of mine. Firstly, do you recognize the phenomenon I'm describing?
Of course, and not just in the media. There's a certain, you know, defeatism that has been plaguing some of our commentary and chattering classes, for lack of a better word, since the minute that this war began. And we've heard all of these predictions, one after the other, just shatter, against the face of reality that we can't do a major ground maneuver into Gaza. There are too many tunnels, and we can't, we can't take on Hezbollah because they have too many rockets. And every time these myths become obviously shown up as myths, it doesn't change anything. They just latch on to something new. What else can we do? And I think that all of this comes down to politics. It's politics infecting the security dialogue in this country. It's very dangerous. It's very disturbing. It really makes me uneasy when I hear these things that I have to explain sometimes to certain people, that we have no choice but to finish the job in the Gaza Strip, because if we don't, we will not only lose the South. I mean, what would happen, these demonstrations that are basically calling on Israel to capitulate to Hamas's demands. What would happen if we did that? If we didn't do what we're doing now? Not only would Hamas be back on the border and basically imminently sending new death squads into the same kibbutzim that are just now beginning to recover, taking their first baby steps. But the Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, would go up in flames. The jihadist elements there would be emboldened throughout the region. And we've got new Sunni fundamentalists in Syria. Let's look at the region. Iran would see a new wave of hope after seeing its ring of fire shattered. If they saw that Hamas survives and starts building back, then they will also be emboldened. This would be an existential threat to our ability to remain in the Middle East. And the fact that this is not talked about, the fact that this is not obvious, because of basically politics, because the disdain for this government has basically drowned out any concept of what's the word I'm looking for? Cost benefit analysis of every option here is really extremely disturbing. I totally recognize it. I see it all the time. I've reached a stage, personally, I can tell you, Benjamin, that I try to put it on mute when I hear these things, because it's too much for me. I don't know what to do with it. I can only just continue to do what I do. But I find it very disturbing. It's basically like a tantrum. It's like I feel like I'm watching, adults having a tantrum. And I just hope that it remains as background noise, as static noise, and that we continue doing what we have to do to make sure that, our children, my children, have a future in this country, and their children as well.
And you've spoken very eloquently about what failing to eradicate Hamas as the leaders of the Gaza Strip would result in from the perspective of our enemies around our borders and beyond our borders. And I agree with you completely. The signal that it would send would be catastrophic in terms of the long-term implications and even the near-term implications toward Israel and its security and towards the safety of people, individuals like the children you are raising in Israel. I want to talk about it from a different perspective. I want to talk about it from the perspective of the reservist, the soldier who is drafted to the Gaza Strip time and time again, even in the midst of this war. I will tell you that I have a very dear friend from my days as a conscript. His name is Yehuda. I want to give him a shout out here on the podcast. Yehuda is again back inside the Gaza Strip, operating along the Philadelphia corridor. He is a married man who is in his second tour of reserve duty inside Gaza. My commander, under whose charge I served inside the Gaza Strip, he has undertaken, I have not served for this long. He has undertaken, I believe, more than a year of service inside the Gaza Strip during this war alone. Now, in my view, no government has the right, and I will say it as strongly as that, has the right to charge its reservists with the responsibility and the challenge of leaving their homes, their businesses, their spouses, their families for such protracted periods of time without rewarding or meeting that level of service and sacrifice with a determined strategy that is implemented that ends with the eradication of the enemy, against whom, and in order to fight, these reservists have been plucked from their day-to-day lives as civilians. I don't think that there is any such thing as a responsible government that would allow for an outcome such as that. Now, that's only, Yaakov, in the context of this war since the massacre of October 7th, 2023. But it does bear hearkening back to the history that we have seen break out with regard to Israel and the Gaza Strip since our withdrawal in 2005. Because since that withdrawal, and I'm not going to hit all of the low notes, but I'll hit some of them, we have fought the wars of Operation Cast Lead in 2008 to 2009, a war that we were compelled to fight because of the terrorism emanating from the Gaza Strip at the hands of Hamas, okay? After they had kneecapped and destroyed and driven out the so-called, falsely termed, moderate Palestinian Authority. So we have fought that war. We fought the war of Operation Pillar of Defense in 2012. We fought the war of Operation Protective Edge in 2014. We fought major operations in the intervening years between 2014 and October the 7th, 2023. And on each of those occasions, tens of thousands of Israelis were taken out of their homes in order to mass on the border with the Gaza Strip. I believe, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe in the case of Operation Protective Edge in 2014, 100,000 to 120,000 reservists were taken out of their homes. They threw on the uniform of the Israel Defense Forces and they went forward ready to make the ultimate sacrifice, each and every one of them, against this enemy. Now, when you think of the recurring nature of our conflict against Hamas inside the Gaza Strip, one has to understand that it is wholly unreasonable and wrong. It's wrong, it's immoral, and it's indicative of a complete disconnect between a government and its armed forces to draft reservists every 2, 3, 4 years to go out to fight with one hand tied behind its back, incidentally, against the same enemy, with the same lack of conclusion, with the same sense when the guns fall temporarily silent, that they will be drafted to return to the same line 2, 3, 4 years hence. It is not a reasonable policy. It is a completely absurd non-policy. It is a totally absurd, wrong-headed non-strategy. And we have tried everything, including that non-strategy, including enriching Hamas by way of Qatari cash that should never have been viewed as a reasonable policy, in my opinion. Never should that have been permitted. And having tried these policies, these notions of controlling Hamas, deterring Hamas, intimidating Hamas, flexing our proverbial muscles as a military fighting force on the border, but not really going after the territory that you are correctly advocating that we should now hold. In trying all of that, in trying to pacify them by way of giving them financial enrichment over a period of years, only for that to blow up and to culminate in the worst atrocity launched against the Jewish people since the horrors of the Holocaust. Having done all of that, it is now high time that the service men and women of the Israel Defense Forces, who are our doctors, who are our teachers, who are our grocery store owners, our plumbers, our decorators, our electricians, but most importantly, our husbands, wives, mothers, fathers, brothers, and sisters, they have to be assured that if they are to be called to the line, they are called to that line in order to finish this enemy. And nothing short of that, in my opinion, is reasonable. And anybody who says, as we hear in the news commentary in Israel, on a near daily basis, oftentimes several times a day, Yaakov, that we need to stop the war because we can restart the war again at a time of our choosing, is utterly, utterly disconnected from the human toll that this cycle into which we have allowed ourselves to be drawn, that this cycle extracts and exacts upon the people of Israel. Now, of course, every single person wants the hostages home. Everybody does. I have not met the reservist who does not want the hostages home. I have not met the conscript who does not want the hostages home. But I will tell you this, Yaakov, our soldiers ultimately must also come home, as must our hostages. And when they do come home, let them come home knowing that they will never have to face this enemy again because it has been completely and utterly vanquished. Such is the charge of this government. Such is what I want to see achieved, and such is the thinking that I believe will actually bring quiet to our borders. You cannot live with this enemy. It cannot be proximate to our borders. It must be banished from our borders, and once it is, it must be kept away from our borders. Do you agree?
100%, 100%. And I think that, we really need to view this as exactly the same way that somebody would view being told that they have tumors, that you're not going to walk away from chemotherapy until those tumors are gone. And if you do, then you're in self-destruct mode. And that's exactly the process that you've been describing. So, basically, one thing I would, I hate to do this in terms of, stats, but I think it's important to point out that 196 hostages living and those murdered by Hamas have been released out of the 255. So Israel has secured the release in multiple ways, mostly through deals, but also through rescue operations of most of the hostages. I think that's important to point out as well, because in no way does that make anything easier for those who remain in the dungeons of Gaza and their terribly suffering families that we can't even understand. But it is important to notice that when people say, "Oh, Israel has abandoned the hostages," things that I hear, but most of the hostages have been released. Does that count for nothing? It's just another one of those things that gets lost in the rhetoric that we hear. And basically, what I think what we're both saying is that we've reached the surreal situation in which the only main source of pressure on decision makers in Israel today is coming from Israel. It's not from the United States anymore. I think, okay, we've got the international community, which we know how to deal with. So the main source of pressure now against finishing the job, as we're both, in full agreement on, is coming from inside, from within Israel. And, that's something we have to reckon with. I don't think that they represent most Israelis. I think most Israelis do want to see this war brought to its correct conclusion. And obviously, there's no contradiction between that, as you say, and wanting to see every hostage brought home. But this is the situation we're in, Benjamin. The main source of pressure on decision makers to not do what we're describing is today, on for me, it's the 20th of March already, is coming from the state of Israel itself. And, I'd be interested in hearing what you think about that. How do we move forward from this position? Is this a dangerous tear in our society? What do you think? This is a real crisis, I think.
Which element of the crisis are you referring to?
Well, the fact that the main source of pressure on decision makers here in Israel
is emanating from Israel.
From Israel and not from the United States anymore, but from here. What do you make of that?
Well, I do think that it's a crisis. I think that there is actually a very genuine concern that needs to be solved, which is that there are too many former security officials who are on the financial take of interest groups, both in Israel and outside Israel, and are willing for the right price, and I dare to say it may be a rather low price, to say whatever the party line may be. That's one problem that you have. The second problem that you have is that there is enormous enmity between the governmental echelons and the security echelons, if I can put it in that term, within the states of Israel. That must be ironed out, and it is not unique to one prime minister or another prime minister, incidentally. I don't know quite how that is to be dealt with. I do think, though, that there needs to be something, some process, a serious process that is brought about in order to avoid the groupthink and the self-selection that has gone on within the military and incidentally within other security forces of the States of Israel for far too long. Now, prior to October the 7th, the States of Israel and the people of Israel were tearing themselves apart over what I would describe as a marginal issue. I don't mean it's a marginal issue because it was trivial. I say it was a marginal issue. I'm referring to judicial reform, judicial overhaul. One can call it whatever one wishes to call it. But the vast majority of Israelis in their day-to-day lives did not feel on their flesh the composition or the powers or the limitations of powers or the unchecked powers of the Supreme Court of the States of Israel. It's simply not something with which an Israeli on a daily basis is having to grapple. So in that sense, I say that it was marginal. I don't mean it was a trivial issue. It was a very, very serious issue. It was being spoken about. We've spoken about it in previous conversations. It was being assessed by the Israeli voter, by the Israeli citizen. But now you have very real and immediate issues, and I want to speak some of them out. You have the 252 hostages that were taken into the Gaza Strip and their family members, not just their immediate family members, but there's second circle and the third circle and the fourth circle of family members whose lives have been utterly changed as a consequence of that horrific act, the abduction of their loved ones. You've got the dead soldiers of the Israel Defense Forces killed on October 7th and far too often and frequently subsequent to that. You've got the 300,000 reservists whose lives have been interrupted, oftentimes who are returning to families that are broken, struggling to hold themselves together as man, wife, and parents. You have the reservists who have returned to lives where their businesses are no longer functioning, where their jobs, their careers are no longer secure. You have the displaced persons from northern Israel and from southern Israel who spent the preponderance of the year after October the 7th living essentially as refugees in their own land. You have the refusal and the obduracy of the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox community, to take its place beneath the national stretcher that is the State of Israel and carry their share of the burden. Just as four soldiers take hold of a corner of a stretcher and carry the burden of an injured soldier in the case that such an effort is required. And then, in addition to all of that, you still have the judicial issue hovering in the background. Now, these are just a few of the challenges that await Israel in the day after this war. You know, so many commentators are obsessing about what the day after inside the Gaza Strip might look like. I do not hear enough people focused on what the day after will look like in Israel. And it's to that issue that I think they should be training their attention. And they are not doing. And within the day after, I believe, to your question, Yaakov, there needs to be a serious reckoning with the standards and the emphasis and the, quite frankly, dishonest media coverage that abounds when it comes to Israel's war against Hamas inside the Gaza Strip. Because the bottom line is, you know, for any fighting force, I pray that its members, if they are a virtuous fighting force, are never actually called to war. But if they should be called to war at any stage during their service, may they only be called to a war that is as just as the war that Israel is currently waging against Hamas. And the fact that it is so criticized, the fact that it is so undermined by our commentators really, really is shameful, and something needs to be done to overhaul that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, you know, just looking at some of the comments that were being made today This is Netanyahu's war. It's his war of political survival. This is the war to bring Ben Gvir back to the government. You just I just read, these things one after the other, and I just really feel like I'm in a sort of Alice in Wonderland, surreal world where people have forgotten about the 7th of October. It's like we're right back, and this never happened. And it's almost as ridiculous as saying, listen, we don't have to finish the war against the Nazis. We could encircle Berlin and some of the German cities, and let's leave it at that. We don't have to save Churchill's government. This is like what I'm hearing, when I translate it, in historical senses. It's utter madness. So yeah, but my consolation is that I believe that most of the Israeli people do not buy into this, that this is an echo chamber that is very used to hearing itself. And I think that this mixture of politics, and by the way, I have not made a single political statement. I have nothing to say right now about whether people are for this government or against this government. I have no problem with people being against any government. That's absolutely fine. That is democracy. Have it out. Go to have elections, have protests. That's fine. But to undermine, as you say, a national war effort, a war effort for our survival, that it's from a moral perspective, I think it's criminal, because it undermines our troops. It undermines the clarity that we need to finish this stubborn enemy that's going to pull every psychological warfare trick against us. We don't have that basic clarity as a people about why we're fighting, what we need to do to finish the job and to secure ourselves. Then we're playing into the enemy's hands collectively. That's what's happening.
Yaakov, I do want to say, just to clarify, lest our listeners should be confused, the day after that I insist people focus their attention toward, namely the day after in Israel, once the guns fall silent, how will we deal with the numerous problems, just a few of which I outlined prior to your response? Responsibility for managing that day after is in no small part on the shoulders of the government. Right? It's not just with regard to how the media is commenting and what commentators have to say and how former security officials are bloviating and talking nonsense. It really will come down to the government. And I will just say that I still believe that it is a sign of leadership for a head of state to say, I take responsibility. Ultimately, the buck stops with me. And I remind everybody that Prime Minister Netanyahu has not said that. To the best of my recollection, Prime Minister Netanyahu has not said that. And I think that it would be, firstly, appropriate for him to say it. Now, of course, the doing of October 7th is not his. And the atrocities launched by Hamas were not atrocities launched by his hand. And I don't mean that he is the direct perpetrator of anything that occurred on that dreadful day. But ultimately, when there is such an horrific event, the responsibility rests on the shoulders of the head of state. And I believe that it would be appropriate for the Prime Minister to express that swiftly, incidentally. I think he should have expressed it right at the beginning. And I also believe that it would help to manage and to bring about stability that is so needed now within Israeli society. I think that many people are confusing the relative absence of the convulsions that preceded October 7th with some sort of pervasive unity within Israel. That is not the case. It is the result of exhaustion. It's the result of fatigue. It's the result of Israelis not knowing where to turn, how to repair, how to build themselves back up. But it is not the result of a friendship, calm, peace, tranquility within the Israeli streets. Far, far from it. I just want to finish with one thought, Yaakov. There was a dreadful scene that occurred during one of the recent hostage releases in which we all looked on and witnessed Hamas transporting two male hostages, Eviatar David and Guy Gilboa Galal, two young men who were kidnapped from the Nova Festival on October the 7th. They transported them in a vehicle with a sliding door to bear witness to the release of several hostages who were on their way back to Israel, to plead into the camera for Benjamin Netanyahu to save them in a choreographed manner, presumably at gunpoint, certainly under the duress of their captors, and then they were driven back to captivity wherever it is that they are being held. And I want to appeal to our listeners to take a moment to ask themselves whether or not whether you, our listeners, our gracious listeners, have done enough in your own way in order to campaign for the release of all of our hostages. Have you, our listeners, have you limited your activity on behalf of the hostages to watching the news and wondering whatever will be? Have you limited your activity on behalf of the hostages to keeping an empty chair perhaps around your dining room table during Shabbat meals? Will you limit your activity for our hostages perhaps to leaving empty chairs around your Seder table when we celebrate Pesach in just a few short weeks? Or have you taken action? Have you written to your elected officials? Have you contacted your congressmen and women? Have you spoken to your local leadership? Have you challenged your congregational rabbis to lead and launch a campaign in your city, in your community, in your town, in order to maintain a clear focus on the plight of Israel's hostages? Because I will tell all of you listeners here, that if you bend your ear in order to consume the media reporting on the return of hostilities inside the Gaza Strip, barely a word is mentioned about the hostages. Barely a word is mentioned about the hostages in the international media. Primarily, the focus is upon the plight of the Gazans, the suffering of the Gazans, and the hardships that the Gazans are living through. If you want that changed, you must act. Do not expect anybody to act on your behalf. And so I'm appealing to all of you. Ask yourselves what you have done today and what more you could do tomorrow for all of the hostages who remain inside the Gaza Strip, the 59 of them, 24 of whom are believed to still be alive, for hostages such as Eviatar David and for Guy Gilboa Dalal, two young men of age with their lives still ahead of them who absolutely need to come home.
Yeah, obviously I agree with all of that, and I guess my final thought about the hostages is that it might be time for the defense establishment and the government to take more risks, because my suspicion is that I'm talking about rescue operations. My suspicion is that there were opportunities and they were deemed to be too dangerous, and I completely understand. But the alternative is to leave them in the hell that they are. So perhaps it's time to be a little bit less risk averse and go for riskier rescue operations. I know that that's extremely daunting and it's very difficult to implement and to be responsible for those decisions, but it might be time to do that. And I would also hope that General Nitzan Alon will be focused on that and not on negotiations with Hamas, which I don't think he should be doing at all in the first place, but actually looking for intelligence that will enable future rescue operations. I hope that we will get that intelligence and that we will act on it if possible, as well as the other scenario that I mentioned, negotiating by cutting Qatar out of the picture. I think, Ben, we really should one day have a whole podcast about Qatar. The whole podcast.
Yes. I actually wanted to speak about the Qataris because they're very much in the headlines today with everything that's gone on in the Prime Minister's office and so on. We haven't arrived at it today.
Yeah.
But I do want to thank you very much, Yaakov, for being with me. I always appreciate bringing your insights to our listeners. I want to thank the listeners. And before you go, listeners, if you have not subscribed to the podcast, but you enjoy this content, please subscribe today at wherever it is you download your podcast from. Share this content with your network and leave us a rating and a review. It really does help us to reach an ever wider audience. We very much thank you in advance of your partnership in that endeavor. So Yaakov, from me and for you and for us and our listeners, it's over and out until the next time.